Hi, welcome to Session 2 of the Women in Ag program sponsored by the Wright County Extension Office. I want to thank my coworker, Missy Lukes, and all of you for inviting me to join you for this session. I'm sorry we couldn't meet live in person Tuesday night. I realize that it's a really busy time of year. There's soccer practice and ball games and school concerts and planting and spraying, and that's okay. I'm glad you can join me today for this recording. My name is Angie Rieck-Hinz. I'm an extension field agronomist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I cover 9 counties in north central Iowa, as indicated by the gray counties on this map. There are currently 10 extension field agronomists located around Iowa. One has retired, and we will fill that position when we're fully staffed. We will have 11. You can always contact me. My contact information is here, and I can put you in touch with the field agronomist for your county, or feel free to call me. We don't have hard boundaries, and if I can help you, I'm more than happy to try and do that. Today we're going to talk about corn planting and soybean planting, and I realize that as I record this today on Thursday, April 29th, is that a lot of our crops already in the ground, but a lot of what I talk about is still relevant for today, even though you may have your crops planted, and certainly will be relevant for future years. So let's talk about corn planting conditions. We have 3 things we want to think about when it comes to planting corn. Planting date, although that is not as critical as once thought, due to the fact that we have better seed quality in this day and age. We have better seed treatments like fungicides and insecticides to help protect that seed if it has to sit in the ground for a little time. We also need to think about soil temperatures, and we need to think about soil moisture. So this is a typical corn planting date map in Iowa. As I said, this is not as critical as it once was, but I kind of want to run you through those different zones just so you understand why we sort of look at this as a basis for decision making. One is we look at this based on historical weather data and when conditions are fit to plant corn, mostly from a soil temperature standpoint. We also know that when we grow corn in north central or northeast Iowa, we want to plant corn as early as we possibly can if conditions are fit, and by conditions I mean soil temperature and soil moisture, so that we can maximize sunlight and growing degree day units throughout the growing season. We also know that we tend to run a risk of frost earlier in that part of Iowa, so we want to make sure that we can get our crop to full maturity before harvest time sets in. When we get into the yellow part of Iowa and even the blue part of Iowa, probably planting date is not as critical. You can see that those windows tend to be a little bit wider than they are for northeast Iowa and north central Iowa. This has a lot to do with temperature, air temperature, and it also has a lot to do with the fact that we can plant some hybrids that are a little bit more full season maturity the further south we go in Iowa. So if we just look at that red zone, for example, and you can see I have numbers available for all those zones. If we looked at a planting date of April 12th through May 2nd for that red zone, we would optimize our relative yield at about 95 to 100%. Now, let me tell you what optimal relative yield means. Relative yield doesn't mean you're going to get 300 bushels an acre. You could. It just means that if conditions are correct during that time, we know we can achieve 95 to 100% potential of that hybrid's yield potential. If we look at April 12th through May 30th, we still have extended that date a little bit. So in northeast Iowa, April 12th to May 2nd, might be a little early for soil conditions and air temperature, but if we look at April 12th through May 30th, we've increased that relative yield potential to 98 to 100%, simply because it's probably warmer at that particular time. We got a little bit longer. And you can see the dates for the other parts of Iowa, but I don't really want you to focus so much on corn planting dates. I kind of wanted to just give you a background on why we choose when to plant corn. A lot of it also has to do with insurance dates, right? And insurance dates have a lot to do with long-term weather patterns as to when our soils finally warm up. Let's take a brief look at the relative yield potential of corn by planting date and population. I'm going to come back to this slide later in this presentation. So if I were going to plant corn at about 35,000 plants per acre, which is a pretty normal plant density in the state of Iowa, if I planted between April 20th and May 5th, my percent of maximum yield or relative yield in this case is 100% at that planting population. That's between April 20th and May 5th. If I back that up about 15 days to look at May 5th through May 10th, I've dropped my relative yield potential by about 4%, right? I haven't captured as much sunlight. I don't have as long as growing season, even though it doesn't seem like 15 days is that critical. If I up my planting population and I'm still planting April 20th to May 5th, I have decreased my relative yield potential a slight bit, 99 or 97% at 40 or 45,000 plants per acre, simply because of the standpoint of I have a little bit extra competition. If I've decreased it below 35,000, I probably am not taking advantage of that population in terms of maximizing yield potential, right? Because I have less seed out there. So there's a lot to learn in this graph, and we'll come back to this a little bit later to talk about replant decisions based on this graph. Now, I said there were 3 things we wanted to think about. We talk about planting date, not as critical as we once thought it was. I want to talk about soil temperature. A lot of those things we see in those maps and planting dates and your insurance risk coverage is based on when our soil temperatures become appropriate for crop planting. For corn, that's at about 50 degrees. Corn germinates when soil temps are around 50 degrees. And as they're trending upward, that's really what we want it to do, right? We want that seed in a relatively warm seed bed at about 50 degrees. That's when it's going to take in water. The water is not going to be as cold as it imbibes water, which it has to do for germination. Temperatures greater than 50 degrees will speed up germination and emergence, and temperatures below 50 degrees will delay germination and emergence. And one of our concerns with that is really with corn, we want to get it in the ground at the same depth. We want to make sure that our soil temperatures are such that we can get that corn out of the ground as quickly as possible so that we can make sure we're not exposing those corn seedlings to our pre-plant herbicides, which could cause some injury, to soil-borne insect pests like seed corn maggots. And we want to make sure that we can get that corn out of the ground and it's not sitting in the ground as long that seedling or small seedling is going to be exposed to our pathogens or our crop diseases for a long period of time, right? One of the reasons we have a fungicide on the soil is to help protect that. The longer that seed sits in the ground, the less protection we tend to have over time. So when we look at soil temperature and emergence, I want to just show you this picture. This particular cornfield was planted April 12th. For some of you out there, this might look familiar. And then the picture was taken April 26th, so a 10-day period between planting and when this picture was taken. You can see that corn seedling has shot a radical. In this case, the radical is the root, and it's the first thing that emerges from a corn seedling. So that was a 10-day period, right? It's got a long ways to go. It hasn't shot a shoot yet. So it has some time to go before emergence. Usually when we think of emergence, it's based on moisture and heat. And we usually need about 100 degree day units, growing degree day units to 120 growing degree day units to get that corn seedling spike up through the ground. That's hybrid dependent. we got to think about moisture, but we need some heat to make that happen. So I wanted to show you some real-time numbers I took from this example. If I look at April 12th through April 26th, which I did, I went to the Iowa Mesonet, and you can see on the right-hand side of that chart where it says growing degree days. So we say corn is growing at a base temperature of about 50 degrees, and the ceiling on that is about 86 degrees. So we know corn will grow at less than 50 degrees, albeit very slow. We know corn's going to continue to grow above 86 degrees, although albeit much slower, right? That whole process slows down when it gets really hot. So when I say I need about 120 growing degree days, if you look at the line that says Ames 8WSW, it's just a weather station at Ames, Iowa. I picked one of the closest locations to where I live. It's Story City. It gives me how much precip I had at that time. So the total precip I had during that time. The Climo number is the average. So our average precip at that time is 1.94 inches for those 10 days. You can see during that 10 days at Ames, Iowa, we are 1.86 inches behind normal for rain. But what I'm interested in this case are the growing degree days. So for that 10-day period, there's been a total of 43.5 growing degree day units. It's a heat-based measurement. So I could show you how to do that in maybe another presentation. Our average during that time is 112.6. So that particular time period of April 12th through April 26th was extremely cool, right? We got some nice temperatures this past weekend, but last week, the primary time this corn was in the ground, it was relatively cold out. We are 69.1 growing degree day units behind normal, at least between for the time period of April 12th through April 26th. And I said it takes about 100 to 120 days to get that corn out of the ground. So that seedling, when I took that picture, only had 43 growing degree day units or heat units on it, and it probably needs closer to 120 to get out of the ground. It just shows you the influence of temperature, and one of the reasons we want to wait until our soil temperatures are at about 50 degrees and warming. We want to get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible. We also need to think about soil moisture. This year, so far, we are relatively dry. Very dry is what I would say. We do need moisture for germination. Those seeds imbibe or take in water. In order to do that, the seed must have good seed to soil contact. So if that seed is laying in dry soil, it's not going to take in water as fast. If the soil is really cloddy, so for example, in years where it's been wet in the fall and we do tillage and we leave a lot of clods, or even in the spring when we do tillage and we leave a very cloddy surface, that seed may not be surrounded by soil, right? There may be air gaps between it and some clods. We need to have that good seed to soil contact. So we want to think about those soil conditions. We don't want them too dry, and we also don't want them too wet. Seed, when we plant it, if it's in uneven moisture, we'll have uneven emergence, which is really critical for corn. We want all that corn to come up at the same time to make sure that that corn's not competing with other corn plants. So if they're behind, they kind of become a weed. So we want to make sure that we have all our planting depth correct. So we want to make sure we have it in moisture. Our corn, we should be planting about 2 to 2.5 inches deep. And we want to make sure there's good moisture there, that we can get that water into the seed and get it to germinate. So there's all kinds of factors, both moisture and temperature kind of play into those planting dates ideas, but soil moisture and soil temperature are really critical. And then we need to think about some other things too, right? If we planted corn really early, super early in April, and let's say we had a warm April and it came up out of the ground, those first few leaves we have, right, the growing point or the primary growing point in that corn is not above the ground. So we can think about well, we could probably frost off a couple of leaves for corn and not hurt it. However, we can't do that with soybeans. So there's all kinds of things that come into play when we think about planting dates. This slide just gives us an example of, we put corn in the ground. The white horizontal line on here indicates about a 2-inch soil depth, right? These were all photos taken from greenhouse grown plants. So we have a seed. We can see there's this tiny little thing that's emerged from the seed that's called the radicle. When we get 5 kernels over, you can see that we have a shoot on that seed, or the mesocotyl, or what, in this case, what helps push up through the soil. So we can see how this corn plant advances. We can see when root development happens. All of these things are dependent on water and heat to make them happen. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what's happening underneath the ground. So we always have that root first. That corn seedling lives off the energy in that corn kernel for a long time before that root development, which really happens at about V2. You can see as that plant gets a little bit bigger, is when we really start taking up water and nutrients from the ground itself. Here's just a close-up shot of a corn seedling, right? We have the primary root system and our secondary root system, and that root expansion is what's pulling all our nutrients and water. So if our seed is too shallow and we're in dry conditions, we could very easily dry that seedling out pretty quickly. This year it's going to be interesting to see what happens as this crop emerges. Just to give you an idea, I took these pictures. I want to give credit to Bob Nielsen at Purdue University. This was a great picture. When we think about a corn seedling, we think about, you can see that yellow line on there where we have the the yellow line, the horizontal yellow line, that's our soil surface. The part of the plant above the ground is called the coleoptile. From that coleoptile, once it opens up, comes our first couple of primary leaves. Below that yellow line is where the crown of the plant is. So our crown is usually about 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface, unless we're planted really shallow, and I'll show you that in the next picture. And then the mesocotyl, which is very important and something we want to go out and look at, right? We want to go out and do that this time of year after our corn has germinated to make sure that our lifeline, or our mesocotyl, because our mesocotyl is what connects our plant not only to the seed for early nutrients, but also to our root system. So if we have soil pathogens, so soil diseases, and our mesocotyl is brown, maybe we've burned some root tips because of anhydrous, we want to go out and scout and look to see what's going on. Maybe that has affected emergence. Maybe our emergence is uneven due to diseases, due to things like anhydrous burn, all those kinds of things. So we want to go out there and see what's going on so we know whether it can be fixed, whether it needs to be replanted, or if we're just going to have to live with conditions the way they are. This is just an idea of what happens when we don't plant our corn at the appropriate depth, and my big concern for this year is our soils are dry and fairly fluffy, right? That doesn't happen every spring. We tend to have wetter springs than this year. When that soil is dry and it's fluffy, we've run a planter through it, we might have fluffed up some soil, is when we tend to plant and then we get one of those pounding rains. Those rains tend to pound down the soil, and all of a sudden our seed is sitting at a much shallower depth, right? That rain takes that soil and pounds it down, takes out all the fluffy airspace in there, and then all of a sudden our seeds are very, very shallow planted. We might not have planted them that shallow, but they've ended up that way because this rain compacted all the soil around the seed. So what we want is effective planting depth at about 2 inches or 2.5 inches on corn. We want to make sure that seed is in moisture. We don't really want to go much below 2.5 inches, but if we get one of those pounding rains this spring in these dry soils and it shallows up that seedling, Sometimes we get what we call rootless corn. That corn obviously is going to root right at that soil surface. You can see that the shallower that seed was planted, in this case on the right-hand side of that ruler, it has a much shorter mesocotyl. We have roots much higher up in the soil profile. We don't have as much, I won't say we don't have as much rooting capacity, but our plant is a lot shallower and is subject to a lot of other injury, like wind injury. If we're having to cultivate our crops, not very many people do that anymore, we can cause some damage to that seedling. So planting depth is also critical. When we have less than ideal soil conditions, so for example, if we got one of those pounding rains and then our soil crusted up, which tends to happen, they dry out and they've become crusty. So there's a thick, hard layer of soil because the soil particles are all been smashed and flattened out, and they're held tightly together, and we get a pounding rain. This tends to happen in highly tilled fields. Then we sometimes get things like that seedling is going to leaf out underground, right? And we may not have emergence of that particular corn plant. Now, the likelihood of that happening across an entire field is pretty small, but it does reduce our stand, which consequently can reduce our yield. So we want to make sure those soil conditions are adequate when we're planting in the right condition. I'm going to switch gears to soybeans a little bit, and then we're going to go back and look at this from a much broader picture on what we should think about every spring, even after we've got the crop in the ground. So soybean planting dates, once again, maybe not as big a deal as what we once said. This is one of the projected maps on maximizing planting date by saying May 1st for the northern part of Iowa. That has a lot to do with frost potential. And then April 5th, 25th or later for the bottom 2/3 of Iowa or southern 2/3 of Iowa. We know that for soybeans, planting earlier can come with the reward of about increasing our bushels per acre by about 3 to 4 bushels per acre. So we can increase that yield potential. This is not always a consistent yield increase. Has a lot to do with, once again, soil conditions and weather conditions. It also comes with the risk of cold injury to the seed, frosted seedlings, and I'll show you some pictures here shortly, and then increased disease pressure if those seeds have to sit in the ground for a long time. So we want to make sure that we're balancing that risk of early planting in both corn and soybeans with the potential of what the weather might do. And that's why we have all these guidance on planting dates. This year, a lot of people planted a lot earlier than they normally did because we've been relatively dry. And I think we all think it's spring in Iowa, and that 30% chance of rain on the forecast might be 0.3 of an inch of rain, or it might be 6 inches, right? So I think after a couple of wet springs, people were anxious to get in plant. And I don't blame them for that. It will be interesting to see what kind of challenges we face as this crop starts emerging from the ground. So when we think about soybeans, we got to think about a couple of other things. We can think about emergence issues. If it's crusty soil, those soybeans can have a hard time poking through the soil. If you can see that picture, you can see those 2 plants on the left were planted a lot deeper than the 2 plants on the right. So some things to think about. If that soil was wet and then planted and it dried out and it got really crusty, so there's a thick layer on top of it, that soybean can have a hard time pushing itself up through there, right? If you look where that soybean is bent over on the left-hand side, that whole hypocotyl crook like this is pulling that soybean, right? The soybean itself is actually the first leaves of the soybeans, the cotyledons is pulling itself up like this. If it gets too much pressure up here on the soil, as it pulls up here, it's going to snap those cotyledons off. And once the cotyledons are gone, you don't have a soybean plant anymore, because that's what it's thriving on, is the energy from those cotyledons. Plus that's where the growing point is between those cotyledons. Sometimes the growing point will still stay intact. So planting depth is critical. Normally planting depth for soybeans is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. This year, I have recommended to a lot of people to go to 2 inches because we can find a little moisture at 2 inches. We certainly wouldn't recommend going much more than 2 inches, maybe a little bit more, 2.25. You'll hear some other states like Nebraska say, hey, we can plant soybeans at a depth of 3 inches. Just understand their soils are a little bit different, don't have as much clay content as we do, don't tend to crust, because all the energy from that soybean seedling is coming out of those cotyledons, or those beginning leaves. And that's what the seed is comprised of. So if they run out of energy before that seedling emerges from the ground, they're not going to be very healthy or likely to survive. So we can have emergence issues from crusty soils, when things were might have been planted and then it rained and that whole soil just crusted up and got really thick and hard on top. It was wet and then it dried out. We can have emergence issues from having cloddy soils, where those soybean seedlings got to push up around those clods if we don't have good seed to soil contact. True for both corn and soybeans. We can have what we call sidewall compaction in that slot, or that seed slot. So as we're planting, if it's really wet and we push really hard on this sidewall, as our planter's going through there, which is what it's designed to do, right? It's making that trench, so it's opening it up. If it's wet and it pushes this, it compacts this soil, and then we tend to get roots that run this way with our corn instead of coming out on both sides of that V trench. So we call that sidewall compaction. If we have sidewall compaction this year, we shouldn't, because it's not wet. But if we did in a normal year, it limits root growth, and that can limit water and nutrient uptake. All right, some other things to think about soybean seedlings. If we plant them too early and they come out of the ground, that growing point for soybeans is right there at the soil surface, right? As that bean comes up out of the ground, the growing point is right there. And they're at a large risk to frost if we're not past our average frost-free date, right? Last year we had a frost on May 5th, and that's what happened with these soybeans. These pictures are actually from that. You can see the ones on the left-hand side, there's one that's dead. It's not going to make it. You can see where the crook in that soybean is all brown and soft and mushy, and it's just not going to survive. And then you can see where the cotyledons have opened up in the same picture in the middle plant there, the right-hand side of that first picture. But if you can see that brown spot where that mesocotyl is, right, or in this case the hypocotyl, I don't know if that one made it, because it had some frost damage. It was probably right at that ground surface when we got that May 5th frost. And even though it's got enough tissue there to support those leaves that are just starting, the cotyledons and leaves, I don't know if that one made it either, because it was damaged. The one on the far right is completely dead. That soybean was actually above the ground when we had that frost temperature. And both those cotyledons are dead, and when they're dead and the growing point is dead, that soybean will not come back. Sometimes you might lose one cotyledon or another. If the growing point's still intact, it will sometimes shoot or break apical dominance, so it will shoot leaves out the side. That plant is certainly dead. So some things to think about on timing there as well. Okay, we've talked about planting, we've talked about soil conditions, temperature, moisture, soil itself, cloddy conditions, too wet, too dry, whatever the case may be. We're going to look at the rest of the season, okay? So, I shouldn't say the rest of the season. We're going to look at early season scouting. We're going to start with diseases. This year, 2021, I'm going to preface that because once Missy puts this on the internet, who knows how long it'll stay out there. We are relatively dry in Iowa. I do not anticipate seedling diseases will be a big issue. If this were a normal year, We tend to see some damping off of our plants, which means death to young plants, right, from seedling diseases. So we can talk about all kinds of different seedling diseases. They get infected by the inoculum or that plant pathogen, and they don't make it. Plant diseases usually show up as small areas in the field, not generally speaking the entire field. So you have to know what you're looking at when you're out there to make sure that you can diagnose it. So let's just take a moment, right? We go out to look at our corn. Our corn has finally emerged, or our soybeans have finally emerged. We want to go out and look at them, and the first thing we need to do is decide what's normal and what's not normal. That's the number one key for deciding if things are going well or not going well. So we need to know what those plants should look like at various stages. So let's take a moment. We'll look at a couple of corn plants here. You can see in the photo on the left-hand side, underneath that residue is a dead corn seedling. It emerged. There's some leaves there, but it has since died. Now, was it infected with a pathogen? My guess would be yes. Could it have struggled to get through that dense layer of residue? Potentially yes, depending on where that seed was placed. There's a lot of things that could have happened there. You can see the plant behind it has brown leaves. It actually looks like that one might have gotten frosted just because the leaf tips are brown and the newest leaf is still green. You can look at the picture on the right, kind of the same thing. A couple of those leaves look, in the lower plant anyway, look kind of brownish yellow. That might have been some frost damage. You can see the plant behind it looks relatively good, right? It's interesting to say that each little plant has its own microcosm of what happens out there. So we need to think about what's going on. We need to say, okay, that's not normal. Now what happened? And do I need to be concerned about that for the whole field, or what might happen next year given the same conditions? Okay, corn, if it's yellow, if it's wilted, if it's stunted, if it's dead, if it has a rotten mesocotyl or that lifeline to the seed, or brown or kind of rotted or gooey seminal roots or nodal roots, most likely caused by a plant pathogen. So a plant disease. Can we do a whole lot about that? Well, we have seed treatments that can help protect our seed. In some cases, we may need to rotate out of those crops, especially if we're in something like continuous corn. Maybe we can break up a disease cycle a little bit. And so we just need to know and understand what's going on. And if you don't know what's going on, we have a wonderful plant disease center on campus at Iowa State that will diagnose what's wrong with those plants for a small fee. So we want to make sure we dig up plants, not pull them out of the ground. We want to look at that root system. We want to decide what it's impacting. So in this case, what's happening is that mesocotyl or that lifeline to the seed is brown, and it's deteriorating. And this corn plant, well, it doesn't look too bad, probably isn't going to survive unless that other root system can start functioning to provide that plant some nutrients and some water. So some things to think about there. Soybeans, not normal, right? If they're look patchy in the field, you got to dig them up and look at roots and other plant parts. You can look at leaves. You can look at cotyledons if they didn't come out of the ground. In that lower picture, right above my head in this particular case, there's a soybean plant. Like the cotyledons look okay, but the lower part of that plant is brown and mushy. It might have just, if you look at that soil, it looks pretty wet. It might have just been in that soil. It took in water. It started to germinate. It might not have been able to push out of that soil if it was really wet. It might have been exposed to some plant pathogen. Whatever the case may be, that plant is probably not going to survive. And so we want to look at the same kind of symptoms for soybeans. Are they wilted? Are they stunted? Are they dead? Do they easily pull out from the soil? Is the root tissue brown or rotting? Are there lesions on that taproot or the hypocotyl? All signs of soybean plant diseases. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on what diseases are what, because that's not really the focus of today. But understand that in a usual spring, we have a much higher chance of plants being, both corn and soybeans, being exposed to plant pathogens. They're native to that soil. But this year, because it's fairly dry, I don't expect that we will have a lot of seedling diseases. Okay, I want to not spend any time talking about the disease triangle. Maybe that'll be another talk later this year. But generally speaking, because we grow corn and soybeans in Iowa, all of the plant pathogens that impact our seedlings are already present in the soil. They have to have the right environmental conditions, and they have to have a plant host, right? The corn or the soybeans themselves, in order for them to impact our crops. So when we look at our conditions for disease development, wet, cool soils can bring on Fusarium or Pythium. Warm, wet soils can bring on Phytophthora, which is usually a bigger disease issue in soybeans. And then warm, moist soils can obviously bring on something like Rhizoctonia in both corn and soybeans. What's interesting is, how do we define the difference between warm and wet and warm and moist? So in order to really diagnose what's out there, I mean, I can go out there after years of experience and say, okay, that looks like Fusarium to me or Pythium to me. But in order to do that and confirm that, I got to take them to the lab for sure, right? I can look at the visual symptoms, but I probably need to look at and have them officially identified at the plant disease lab. So why do we care? We care because if our plants are sick and they die, we have a stand loss, which could lead to yield loss. So do we need to replant? So in order to do that, we need to have stand counts. We need to know what we put out there for seed for both corn and soybeans. We need to know if it was a disease issue, maybe a soil crusting issue. This week I had phone calls about people that underplanted corn. In other words, they cut their population from 36,000 plants per acre, accidentally didn't adjust something on the planter, and are only planting 20,000 plants per acre, right? That's a huge loss in potential yield right there just from not having plants out there. So we need to do stand counts, and then we need to make decisions on, do we need to replant? Can we leave that stand as is? If we have to rip it up, we're spending money on diesel and time. If we replant, that's more cost on seed. Not to mention, we've already probably got some chemical or herbicides out there, so what can we do? So we want to make sure we understand what we planned to have out there, right? Our planning population, versus what we have, to make some decisions on whether we should replant things. And obviously, I'm talking about this now because now is the time to talk about this. So we're going to go through how to do stand counts really quickly. I wish we were in the field, and maybe we'll be able to do that next year in this group. So let's talk about how we do this. I've already got 3 field calls lined up for next week to go out and do this for people that have crop out of the ground already. So we need a tape measure, something to write on so we can take some notes, maybe a calculator. Don't always need a calculator, but you might want a calculator, and most of them have us on our phone. So this is a photo of my women's cohort doing a plant stand assessment. So to decide whether we need to replant this corn or not. It's just barely out of the ground, you can see in that picture. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to measure 1/1000th of an acre. It makes it easier to do the math. So that depends on row width. So if you're in 30-inch corn, if you planted 30-inch wide rows, you need 17 feet 5 inches on that tape measure to mark out 1/1000th of an acre on that row. If it's 20-inch corn, it's 26 feet 2 inches. If it's 15-inch corn, it's 34 feet 10 inches. So if I lay my tape measure out on the ground, say I have 30-inch corn, I measure out 17 feet 5 inches. Now, I'm going to do this in a whole bunch of places in this field because I don't want to bias my self by just looking at the really good areas or the bad areas, right? Maybe where something happened that a lot of plants didn't emerge. I want to look at the average for that field, or at least the average for maybe the south end of the field or the west end of the field, or something where I didn't think maybe the planter was in the ground at the right depth, or I wasn't dropping seed like I should have been. So I want to make sure that I can measure that as a field-wide perspective and maybe as an area independently. When I measure out that 17 feet 5 inches, I'm going to count the number of plants, either corn or soybeans, in that 17 feet 5 inches. I'm going to do that several times, randomly selected areas, right? If you see me out there throwing my big trowel or my spade around, I try to do that so I'm not biasing myself with what my eyes see, but I'm going to random areas in the field. And then I want to do that a couple dozen times maybe throughout that field, depending on the field is. And then I'm going to take that stand count and I'm going to multiply it to determine the plants per acre. So if I count out 17 feet 5 inches and I get 34 plants, that's 34,000 plants per acre. If that's what my seeding rate was, that's really good, right? So it's pretty easy math to do that. So once again, if I count out 17 feet 5 inches, I count 34 corn plants in that 17 feet 5 inches. That's 34,500 plants in per acre. And if that's what my seeding rate was, that's fantastic. If it's lower than that or higher than that, and that's not what I was intending, if it's lower than that, we might have to decide if we're going to replant or need to replant. While we're out there looking, take up time to dig the plants, dig up the seedlings, and check for what's going on, right? This is what we call crop scouting. Are there seedling diseases or root rots? Did we burn those corn roots with anhydrous ammonia? Just that corn plant got planted too close to that anhydrous band. Do we have herbicide injury? The one thing about cold soils is when plants don't emerge as quickly as they do under normal conditions, and we've got our pre-plant herbicides down, our corn or soybean seedlings may be exposed to a herbicide that's in that soil for a longer period of time, and they may become damaged. They may not die, but they may have some herbicide injury. They may grow out of it. Most of the time they do, but not always. Do we have any insect damage or injury, right? Right now, it's April, the end of April, and I want to start thinking about black cutworms, cutting corn. I want to start thinking about true armyworms. There's all kinds of pests out there at all times, so I want to see if something's feeding on that plant. Maybe I've got some soil-dwelling pests, right? Grub injury, whatever the case may be, that's taking out my seedlings. Is it planter-related? All right, maybe I didn't get the planting depth deep enough. I need to think about what that means for later in the season, or make sure to remind myself to get that planter adjusted accordingly for next year. If I'm planting continuously for a long time, maybe I've got corn emerged and I'm still planting corn, right? It happens. Go look at that plant field that's been planted, dig some seeds up, make sure they're deep enough. We should stop in every field under all different conditions and make sure that we're getting that seed in the ground at the right depth. The seed is being adequately spaced or singulated as it's planted so we don't have skips or doubles. All kinds of things we can look at when we're out in the field. Okay, so this is kind of the same thing, right? I literally said I had how many feet length of row. So if I had 30-inch rows, I needed 17 feet 5 inches. Or I can look at plant population per acre. So if I looked at the number of plants per foot a row, if I only had one plant in a whole foot and I had 30-inch rows, that's only 17,424 plants per acre. That's not really where I want to be for corn, right? I want to be more around 2 plants per foot, or that 34,000. If I got 3 plants per foot from a corn standpoint, I'm sorry, that was my stupid cat trying to get in on the camera action. I've got 52,000 plus plants out there per acre. A little high, for way too high, right? To be sustainable for good corn production. And then we can also look at the hula hoop method, especially if we got 15-inch row soybeans or drilled soybeans at 7.5 inches. In this particular case, if you want a hula hoop, I got plenty of hula hoops just to do this kind of thing. We go out there, we look at that hula hoop measurement, we look at the diameter of that hula hoop. If we got a 30-inch hula hoop, we're going to multiply the number of plants by 8,900. So we're going to take the number of plants inside the hula hoop times that multiplication factor to get plants per acre. It's a little bit easier to do that when we have narrow row soybeans. Okay, folks, we're almost done. So I wanted to come back to this slide. This is really about replant decisions because this is the time of year we need to think about whether we have to replant a field for whatever reason, okay? It could have been the fact that we planted, and in this case we're looking at corn. Let's say we planted corn and for some reason it didn't come out of the ground, or it came out of the ground. I didn't plant the right planting population in the first place, right? I screwed up my planter and I didn't get the right population in the ground. So this is how I'm going to look at this chart. And we saw this chart before, but I also use this chart to make replant decisions. Let's say I planted my corn April 20th, right? Not uncommon for this year. I dropped 35,000 seeds or plants per acre. That's my goal, right? We know that they all don't come out of the ground, and sometimes they come out of the ground and then they die, right? My planting yield potential, relative yield potential at that point was 100%, right? Where I want it to be. Okay, for whatever reason, that's what I thought I did. That's not what I did. I come back, I take a stand count. I'm down to 20,000 plants per acre. And I'm like, man, that is not enough, right? I need to be up here. This is average. I'm down here. What do I do? Okay. It's now May 15th, right? Took some time to get the corn out of the ground. It's May 15th. Do I replant it or do I go with what I have? Well, if I plant 35,000 plants per acre on May, well, I actually wanted to plant 35,000, but say I'm down to 20,000. If I plant again on May 15th, right, I'm at an 85% of that maximum yield, where if I left this stand at 20,000 because I planted it earlier, I'm at 89% of my relative yield potential. Or you can look at it this way. Here's where I wanted to be. Here's where I actually am. I'm going to go and replant it, but my yield potential is not as great as that stand looking out there. Things we'd have to think about is I have less corn plants out there. I have a more open canopy. What's that going to do for my weed control, correct? You guys can't see this, but I'm getting an awful lot of help behind the screen today. So I keep batting his head, hoping he'll go away. Soybean replant decisions. If we're at less than 75,000 plants per acre when it's planted prior to mid-May, we may want to think about replanting it. We really want our stand count to be at least 100,000 plants per acre when we come down to soybeans. We're going to want to consider replanting it if it's less than 50 to 60,000 plants per acre when it's planted late May to June. Once again, we want to make sure that we have approximately 100,000 plants per acre. Other things we need to think about. Stand uniformity. If the stand's fairly uniform, maybe we can get by without replanting it. Especially with soybeans, because soybeans will compensate. If they have more space, they'll put on more pods and have more beans. We need to think about what it costs to go in and replant those soybeans. We need to think about what it costs to go in and replant the corn as well, right? It takes time, it takes fuel, it takes more seed. We need to think about, we already have a herbicide out there, what that might mean. We need to think about hybrid and variety and maturity. Maybe by the time I realize I have to replant, I can't get the same hybrid with the same maturity, or I can't get the same variety. I need to think about the traits that my corn or beans have, so I'm not mixing up traits and replanting half a field that has one trait and the rest of the field had the variety with the original trait and I accidentally spray the wrong herbicide. Lots of decisions to be made. Okay, I'm done. This took about 50 minutes. I think that's where Missy wanted me to be. I have 2 resources I want to share with you that you can go check out. If you do not receive Iowa State University's integrated crop management newsletter, I provided the link for it right here. I would highly suggest that you subscribe to it. It's free. You can set up your subscription that you get the news release every time it comes out. So if one comes out today, you get that article, or you can wait and get them all on Friday. So you get the whole week at one time. That's completely up to you, but this is where the field agronomists such as myself, our campus specialists, we're keeping an eye on things, right? We're reporting things and challenges. We have a lot of information in there for this spring about planting into dry soils or herbicide considerations for all that volunteer corn left over from that derecho last year. So it's a really good source of information. I also put out my own crops newsletter. If you want to get in touch with Missy or I'll be happy to add you to that newsletter. And then the second link is a link to all the extension field agronomists. So their contact information, their phone numbers, their emails, the counties they cover, you'll see that on the map. If you scroll down just a little bit, when you get to that page, you'll see who everybody is. And you are welcome to call any of us at any time. This is what we do. All right, great. I feel like I rambled for an hour. Probably did. I'm here to help. That's my job. So please feel free to call me. Happy to come out and look at fields. If I think I'm a little too far away, I can always ask one of my colleagues to do that as well. And I just want to wish you all the best for this 2021 growing season. Thank you.